I am Paul Bennett. I am 70 years old, and for the last 5 years, I thought I was simply enjoying the quiet twilight of a life well lived. I spent 40 grueling years building a commercial real estate empire from the dirt up, sacrificing my sleep, my health, and sometimes my peace of mind to ensure my family would never know the sting of poverty. But to my only daughter, Rachel, and her slick, fast-talking husband, Todd, I was not a father or a patriarch. I was just an expiration date attached to a bank account. Last Friday, as I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror, tying my tie for a rare dinner invitation at their sprawling suburban estate, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from my corporate attorney, Stephen Carmichael. It simply read, "Call me immediately." I dialed his number, and what he told me about my own flesh and blood sent a chill straight into my bones. Before I tell you what they did and exactly how I made them pay for it, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed always eventually destroys the greedy. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who had weathered decades of ruthless corporate battles, economic crashes, and the heartbreaking loss of a beloved wife. But nothing could have prepared me for the words Stephen spoke over the phone. He did not even bother to say hello. He just said Paul, Todd, and Rachel filed a quiet legal petition this morning. They are trying to declare you mentally incompetent. I gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, the cold surface grounding me as the room suddenly felt like it was spinning. Mentally incompetent, I asked, my voice barely above a harsh whisper. Stephen's tone was dead serious, stripped of all his usual professional warmth. They submitted medical evaluations claiming you have advanced dementia, Paul. They are going for a full conservatorship. They want legal authorization to seize your home, your assets, and your visible trust fund. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. My own daughter. The little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway. The child I had worked 18-hour days to put through the best universities was trying to legally erase my mind to get her hands on my money. I asked Stephen how they could possibly have medical records proving a disease I did not have. He explained that they had found a shady physician willing to sign off on fabricated symptoms based entirely on their testimonies as my deeply concerned family members. They thought I was an easy target. They saw me as a lonely widower living in a modest 3-bedroom house disconnected from the modern world and ripe for the picking. I told Stephen to put a freeze on everything from his end, but to keep our knowledge of their plan absolutely quiet. I hung up the phone, stared at my reflection, and wiped away the single tear of heartbreak that had escaped my eye. I took a deep breath, smoothed my tie, and made a decision right then and there. If they wanted a frail, senile old man who was losing his grip on reality, I was going to give them the performance of a lifetime. An hour later, I pulled my reliable 10-year-old sedan into the sweeping circular driveway of their massive modern farmhouse in the upscale suburbs. I parked next to Todd's brand-new imported sports car, a vehicle I now realized he was likely desperate to pay for. When Rachel opened the heavy oak front door, I intentionally hunched my shoulders, let my hands tremble slightly, and gave her a confused, wandering smile. "Hi, sweetheart," I mumbled, pretending to fumble clumsily with my car keys. She sighed, a sound full of manufactured pity and hidden annoyance, and took my arm as if I were made of brittle glass. "Come on in, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that sickening, patronizing tone people usually reserve for toddlers. Todd was waiting in the dining room, wearing a sharply tailored shirt, casually pouring wine. I noticed immediately that he poured me a glass from a cheap $10 bottle sitting on the kitchen island, while discreetly slipping a $300 vintage Cabernet back into the temperature-controlled wine cooler for himself and my daughter. It was a small, petty gesture, but it told me everything I needed to know about how little they valued me as a human being. During dinner, the disrespect was palpable and suffocating. Rachel actually reached over and cut my steak for me, exchanging exasperated, knowing looks with Todd whenever I purposely pretended to lose my train of thought mid-sentence. They talked right over me loudly, discussing their upcoming luxury vacation to Aspen and a massive kitchen remodel, casually spending money they firmly believed was already theirs. Then came the ambush. After dessert was cleared, Todd cleared his throat, put on a blindingly fake smile, and slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the mahogany table. "Paul," he said, using my first name with a practiced ease that made my stomach turn. "These are just some routine tax documents for the business. Since you handed the management over to us a few years ago, the accountants just need your signature to clear up some end-of-year filing." I looked down at the papers. The print was intentionally small, but my eyesight was perfectly fine. Right at the top of the second page, barely hidden under a generic cover sheet, were the words conservatorship, consent, and voluntary transfer of assets. They were sitting in my presence, eating the food my legacy paid for trying to trick me into signing away my own freedom and dignity. My blood boiled with a rage so hot, I thought I might spontaneously combust, but my face remained a blank, vacant canvas. I picked up the pen with a deliberately shaking hand. "Oh my!" I stammered, squinting hard at the pages and bringing my face inches from the paper. "There are so many words here, Todd. My head feels a little fuzzy today. I just cannot seem to focus." Rachel leaned in close, her expensive perfume suffocatingly sweet. "It is okay, Dad. Just sign at the bottom line. We are taking care of everything for you. You do not need to worry your tired head anymore." I brought the tip of the pen down to the paper, letting my hand tremble violently. Then, with a perfectly timed gasp of manufactured surprise, I knocked my elbow directly into my full, heavy glass of ice water. The water cascaded over the table in a tidal wave, thoroughly soaking the entire stack of legal documents. The dark ink bled instantly, pages tore as they turned to mush, and the conservatorship forms were completely and utterly ruined. "Oh no," I cried out, acting terribly flustered and embarrassed, patting at the mess with a useless cloth napkin. "Look what I have done. I am so clumsy lately. I am so sorry, Todd." Todd's face turned beet red. A thick vein bulged in his forehead as he stared at the ruined paperwork that was supposed to be his golden ticket. He looked like he wanted to reach across the table and strangle me, but he forced a tight, agonizing smile that looked more like a grimace. "It is fine, Paul," he hissed through gritted teeth, his hands balling into fists. "We will just have to print new ones for you to sign later." I apologized profusely, playing the humiliated old man, and insisted I was simply too tired to stay any longer. As I drove home through the dark streets that night, the frail old man completely vanished. My grip on the steering wheel was iron tight. I had just bought myself 48 hours, and I was going to use every single second of it to meticulously orchestrate their destruction. The next morning, the sun had barely risen over the city skyline when I walked into a secure, undisclosed office building downtown. Sitting at a large, polished conference table were Stephen Carmichael, my attorney of 30 years, and Brian, a brilliant forensic accountant and private investigator, who looked like he had not slept in a week. They did not look at me with pity or condescension. They knew the real Paul Bennett. 5 years ago, when my beautiful wife passed away, I decided I wanted to step back, grieve in peace, and enjoy a quiet life. I handed the day-to-day management of my real estate development company over to Todd and Rachel. I let them have the corner offices, the prestigious executive titles, and the hefty unearned salaries. But what I never told them, what I kept entirely to myself, as a final measure of protection, was that I never actually transferred the majority voting shares. I retained absolute ownership of the corporate entity, hiding my controlling stake behind an ironclad blind trust that Stephen managed. I wanted to see if they could steer the ship before I gave them the keys to the ocean. It turned out they were intentionally sinking it. Brian pushed a thick red folder across the table toward me. "Paul, it is much worse than we initially thought," Brian said, his voice grim and heavy with exhaustion. "Todd has not just mismanaged the company. He has leveraged it to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. He took out massive corporate loans to fund their lavish lifestyle and dumped millions into terrible offshore investments that completely tanked." I flipped through the pages, staring at the catastrophic numbers. Millions of dollars bled dry, squandered on luxury cars, designer clothes, and bad bets. But Brian was not finished. He took a deep breath and slid one final damning document in front of me. That is not the worst part, Paul. Todd needed more cash to cover his disastrous margin calls. When the corporate credit completely dried up, he went after your personal assets. I looked down at the paper. It was a loan agreement from a predatory private equity firm known in the industry for their ruthless, aggressive foreclosures. The loan was for $2 million. And the collateral listed on the final page was my home. My modest suburban house where I had raised Rachel, where my wife had spent her final peaceful days, the only sanctuary I had left in the world. Todd forged your signature, Stephen explained, pointing a pen to the bottom of the page where my name was scrawled in an incredibly sloppy imitation of my handwriting. He used a fake notary that he bribed to leverage your home. If he defaults on this $2 million loan, which our financial digging shows he is on the verge of doing, next week that private equity firm will seize your house and throw you out on the street by the end of the month. That is exactly why they are rushing the conservatorship. They desperately need legal control of your personal trust fund to pay off this secret debt before it blows up in their faces and sends Todd to federal prison. The silence in the conference room was suffocatingly heavy. I looked at the forged signature on the paper. My own daughter and the arrogant man she chose to marry had put a definitive price tag on my sanity, my freedom, and my home. They saw me as nothing more than a disposable resource, a stepping stone to cover up their own bottomless greed and pathetic failures. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me, freezing any lingering paternal affection I had left into solid ice. I looked up at Stephen and Brian, my posture perfectly straight. Do not file any injunctions or contest the conservatorship yet. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. Let them think they are winning this game. Let them think I am just a confused, helpless old man waiting patiently for the end. Stephen smiled, a sharp, predatory grin of a lawyer who knew a slaughter was coming. What is the play, Paul? I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands on the table. Find out exactly who holds that $2 million debt, I instructed Brian. And Stephen, prepare the offshore accounts I have been sitting on for 40 years. We are going to buy Todd's debt through a shell company. I am going to become his sole unforgiving creditor, and when the time is exactly right, I am going to take everything from him. The war room immediately went to work. I left the building and walked out into the crisp morning air. I was 70 years old, but as I looked up at the towering buildings I had helped build, I felt a fire in my veins that I had not felt since I was 30. They thought they were gently pushing me into a quiet grave, but they had just awakened a sleeping giant, and the ground beneath their feet was about to crumble. I was sitting in my favorite armchair by the living room window, watching the morning light filter through the thick branches of the oak trees I had planted 30 years ago. This house was a living museum of my entire life. The solid hardwood floors still bore the faint scratches from when my daughter Rachel was learning how to ride her tricycle indoors during a rainy winter. The large marble kitchen island was the exact spot where my late wife and I had shared countless cups of coffee planning our future. It was a quiet and peaceful morning until the sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the silence. I knew they would not wait long. Desperation always makes greedy people reckless. I stood up and began to shuffle toward the front door. I intentionally slowed my pace, letting my shoulders slump heavily to adopt the posture of a tired and defeated old man. I opened the heavy wooden door to find a man in his early 40s standing on my porch. He wore a crisp blue polo shirt and neatly pressed khaki pants while holding a digital tablet in his hand. He flashed a practiced, hollow smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," he said with a smooth, professional voice. His eyes were already darting past my shoulder to evaluate the expensive light fixtures in my foyer. "Your son-in-law Todd sent me over today. I am a contractor here to inspect your roof and check the foundation for some structural settling. Todd mentioned you might need some urgent repairs done to the property." I looked at the man and let my mouth hang slightly open in a carefully rehearsed mask of mild confusion. But behind my clouded eyes, my mind was razor-sharp and calculating. I recognized him almost instantly. When you spend 4 decades navigating the ruthless world of commercial real estate, you learn to quickly identify the faces of the corporate vultures. This man was not a roofer, and he was certainly not a structural engineer. He was a senior property appraiser for the exact private equity firm that Todd had borrowed the $2 million from. They were not here to fix my roof or check my foundation. They were here to secretly value my home for an imminent and hostile foreclosure. Todd was completely out of time, and the financial wolves were already circling my property to collect his massive secret debt. "Oh, Todd sent you," I murmured, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound incredibly fragile and relieved. "That is so very nice of him to do. He is always worrying about my safety. Please come in and excuse the mess." There was absolutely no mess in my home, but playing the overwhelmed and declining widower was a crucial part of my strategy. The appraiser stepped inside, and his polished leather shoes tapped loudly against the hardwood. He did not look up at the ceiling to check for water damage. He did not look at the walls for structural cracks. He was entirely focused on measuring the custom crown molding, the high-end appliances, and the total square footage of the open floor plan. He was literally pricing my cherished memories, calculating exactly how quickly his firm could liquidate my lifelong sanctuary to cover Todd's pathetic gambling losses and offshore investment failures. I led him through the house, shuffling my feet and leaning heavily against the walls for fake support. I pointed out completely irrelevant things like a squeaky cabinet door in the hallway or a slightly loose floorboard in the den. I babbled aimlessly about the weather and my sore joints to complete the illusion of a rapidly declining mind. He humored me with quick, dismissive nods while tapping rapidly on the screen of his digital tablet. "This is a truly beautiful property, Mr. Bennett," he said, his tone entirely transactional and cold. "It has a very high market value for this specific neighborhood. Todd actually mentioned you might be downsizing very soon. Is that correct?" I stopped walking and let out a long, dramatic sigh. "Downsizing," I repeated, looking around the living room with manufactured sadness and confusion. "I suppose so. My memory is just not what it used to be these days. Todd handles all my important paperwork now. He takes such good care of me." The appraiser smirked, a cruel little expression that told me he knew exactly what Todd was plotting. We eventually reached the kitchen. I offered him a cup of coffee. He politely declined while checking his expensive watch, clearly eager to finish the appraisal and leave the premises. I insisted, playing the role of the lonely old man who was simply desperate for a few minutes of human company. "Just a quick cup of hot tea," I pleaded gently. "I get so few visitors these days, and it would mean the world to me." He let out a quiet sigh of annoyance and finally agreed, leaning casually against my marble counter. This was my window of opportunity. I turned my back to him and shuffled slowly toward the stove. As I reached up for the kettle, I covertly slipped my smartphone out of my pocket. I blindly hit the record button and placed the phone face down on the counter right next to him, hiding it perfectly behind a decorative fruit bowl. "You know," I said, as I poured water into the kettle, "Todd told me this morning that he was sending someone to help with the house. But my mind is so foggy, I completely forgot what he said you were actually doing here. Are you going to fix that awful leak in the guest bathroom upstairs?" The appraiser chuckled softly, letting his professional guard down completely in front of what he believed was a clueless senior citizen. "No, Mr. Bennett. I am not a plumber. I am a property appraiser. Todd ordered a fast-track valuation of this entire property. We need to finalize the collateral numbers for my firm by tomorrow afternoon. He told my boss that you were moving into a care facility this week, so we need the foreclosure appraisal expedited to clear the debt transfer." I turned around, holding a delicate teacup, and looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Foreclosure?" I asked, letting my voice crack with perfect vulnerability. "I do not understand that word. Is Todd selling my house?" The appraiser waved a dismissive hand as if brushing away a bothersome insect. "Do not worry about the details, Mr. Bennett. Todd is handling the entire transition for you. I just need to get these final numbers back to my office so we can process the deed transfer immediately. My firm does not like to wait around when a corporate loan is this close to a hard default. He had said exactly what I needed him to say. He had explicitly named the fast-track foreclosure, the debt transfer, and Todd's direct illegal instructions. I smiled a warm, vacant smile. "Oh well, I trust Todd completely," I said cheerfully. "He is such a good boy." The appraiser finished his quick tour of the backyard, tapped the final numbers into his tablet, and walked out my front door without even bothering to say goodbye. The very moment his car pulled out of my driveway, my trembling hands became rock steady. My hunched posture straightened up to my full height. I walked back to the kitchen counter, picked up my phone, and saved the audio file. I immediately sent a secure, encrypted copy to my lawyer, Stephen, and my investigator, Brian. It was the golden piece of evidence. Todd was actively facilitating the theft of my personal home to cover his fraudulent loans, and he was using the private equity firm to do his dirty work. Just as I poured the untouched tea down the sink, my phone buzzed violently in my hand. It was a text message from Todd. I opened the message, and the words glowing on the bright screen made my blood run ice cold. Paul, the text read, "The contractor said he just finished looking at the house. We have an appointment at my office tomorrow morning at 9 sharp to sign the new tax documents. Do not be late, and please do not spill anything this time. Rachel and I have been talking a lot this morning. Your confusion at dinner yesterday was very concerning to us. If you cannot handle signing these simple papers tomorrow, we are going to have to move you into an assisted living facility by the end of the week for your own safety. We already picked out a nice secure room for you, for your own safety." The words echoed in my mind like a physical threat. They were openly telling me that they were going to lock me away in a sterile room, drug me into quiet submission, and strip my life away piece by piece. They genuinely thought this cruel threat would terrify me into blind compliance. They thought the overwhelming fear of losing my independence would make me run to his corporate office tomorrow morning and sign my life away just to buy a few more miserable weeks of freedom in my own home. They were using my age and my unconditional love for my daughter as a loaded weapon against me. I read the text message one more time, letting the sheer, unadulterated malice of their plan burn deeply into my memory. I did not reply to his message. I simply locked my phone screen and looked around my beautiful, quiet home. Todd and Rachel thought they had me completely backed into a desperate corner. They thought they had quietly tied the financial noose around my neck and were just sitting back, waiting for me to step off the chair. But tomorrow morning, I was going to walk right into Todd's lavish corporate office. I was going to look my greedy, entitled daughter and her desperate, fraudulent husband right in their eyes. I was going to play the broken, terrified father they so desperately wanted me to be. And then, with a steady hand and a clear mind, I was going to hand them the exact shovel they would use to dig their own inescapable graves. I left my quiet suburban home and drove straight back to the city. The drive felt like a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my old sedan so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress to protect my family, and now I was driving back to the war room to learn exactly how my own son-in-law had decided to burn it down. When I arrived at the secure downtown office, Brian and Stephen were already waiting for me. The large conference table was entirely covered in financial printouts, bank statements, and corporate ledgers. Brian had several computer monitors glowing brightly against the dim walls of the room, displaying a complex web of transactions that traced the bleeding veins of my life's work. "Please sit down, Paul," Brian said quietly. His voice carried the heavy weight of a man who spent his life digging through the filthy secrets people tried to bury. We followed the money. All of it. Todd thought he was a genius at hiding his tracks by funneling cash through dummy corporations, but he left a digital trail a mile wide. I sat at the head of the table and stared at the chaotic map of my stolen legacy. "Tell me exactly what he did," I instructed. Brian brought up a map on the largest screen. It showed a half-finished luxury commercial development on a coastal property outside the country. Todd wanted to play the big-shot international developer, Brian explained. 3 years ago, he secretly diverted millions from your company's operational reserves to fund a massive offshore resort project. He bypassed the board of directors by forging your signature on the executive authorizations. But he was incredibly arrogant and entirely out of his depth. He got swindled by corrupt local contractors hit with massive environmental fines, and the foreign government ultimately seized the land. He lost $8 million of your corporate cash in a single stroke, and he has been cooking the company books ever since to hide the massive hole in the balance sheet. I shook my head slowly, feeling a bitter combination of professional disgust and personal rage. He took the secure, stable empire I built and treated it like his own personal casino. That is an unfortunately accurate choice of words, Brian continued, pulling a separate stack of bank records from the pile. The offshore disaster is what drained your company, but it does not completely explain why he is currently $2 million in debt to a predatory private equity firm, or why he is so desperate that he forged the deed to your personal home. The corporate losses simply tanked the business. The personal debt, however, stems from something much darker. Brian slid a photograph across the table. It showed Todd sitting at a felt-covered table in what looked like a dimly lit, high-stakes private club surrounded by stacks of chips and very dangerous-looking men. Todd has a severe gambling addiction, Brian said, his tone utterly clinical. He has been a regular in unregulated high-limit underground poker games for the last 2 years. When he lost the offshore money and realized he could not quickly replace it, he tried to win it back at the tables. He took out massive personal loans from underground syndicates. When the syndicates threatened to break his legs, he panicked. He approached that ruthless private equity firm to pay off the illegal bookies. That private equity loan requires a hard asset as collateral. Todd did not have any assets of his own because he leased his cars and his lifestyle. So he forged the paperwork and offered up your house. I stared at the photograph of the man who married my daughter. He looked sweating, desperate, and pathetic. He had gambled away his pride, my company, and finally, my home. But the ultimate pain had not yet been delivered. I looked up at Brian and Stephen. The silence in the room told me there was more. I knew how to read a room, and my two closest allies were avoiding my gaze. "What else did you find?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Do not hold anything back from me." Stephen let out a heavy breath and adjusted his glasses. "Paul, we had to be absolutely certain about the scope of the conspiracy. We needed to know if Rachel was a victim of Todd's financial abuse or if she was fully aware of the situation. Brian managed to clone the cloud backup of the luxury SUV your company provides for them. The vehicle has an internal voice command system that frequently records audio inside the cabin. We pulled a recording from yesterday afternoon, right before you went over for dinner." Stephen paused, placing a hand on the table. "You do not have to listen to this right now, Paul. We have the evidence we need." "Play it," I commanded. I needed to hear it. I needed to know exactly who I was going to war against. Brian clicked his mouse. The audio was crystal clear. First, I heard the hum of the car engine, followed by the sound of Todd's voice. He sounded frantic, complaining about the deadline from the private equity firm and stressing over how they were going to get me to sign the conservatorship papers. And then I heard my daughter. Rachel's voice filled the room, stripped of all the fake, sugary sweetness she used when she spoke to me. "I do not understand why this is taking so long," she complained bitterly. "He is 70 years old, Todd. He should have expired by now. Every time I look at him, all I can think about is how much of my inheritance is being tied up in his ridiculous imaginary medical expenses just to keep up this stupid charade." A cold, invisible hand wrapped around my throat, squeezing the breath right out of my lungs. "We just need him to sign the papers tonight," Todd replied on the recording. "Once we have the conservatorship approved by the judge, we put him in that lockdown facility. The private equity guys take his house, my debt is cleared, and we control the trust fund. It is foolproof." Rachel let out a cruel, impatient sigh. "Just make sure the facility is cheap. We are not wasting the trust fund on premium care for someone who barely knows what day it is." "I just want my money, Todd." I have been waiting my entire life to finally be rich without having to answer to him. I am done playing the devoted daughter. The recording clicked off, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I sat completely motionless in my chair. For 40 years, I had labored under the fundamental belief that a father's ultimate duty was to provide, to protect, and to leave a legacy of security for his children. I had wiped her tears when she fell off the swing set. I had proudly walked her down the aisle and handed her to a man I thought would protect her. I had built an entire world just so she would never have to struggle. And in return, she was sitting in a luxury car paid for by my sweat, calculating how cheaply she could lock me in a cage, complaining that my heart had not stopped beating fast enough to suit her financial schedule. She had invented fake medical expenses to justify draining my accounts, resentful of the very air I was breathing. She was not a victim of Todd's gambling or his fraudulent schemes. She was the architect of my demise. She was fully consciously and eagerly plotting my destruction. The final lingering threads of my paternal hesitation dissolved into nothingness. The father who had loved Rachel with his entire soul died in that conference room, murdered by the sound of her own voice. In his place, the ruthless, unrelenting businessman who had conquered the commercial real estate world was entirely reborn. I slowly stood up from the table and smoothed the wrinkles from my jacket. I looked at the digital map of Todd's pathetic financial life on the monitors. The anger was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. "Stephen," I said, my voice carrying the sharp, cold authority of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I do not just want to defend myself. I do not just want to stop the conservatorship. I want to own every single mistake they have ever made." Stephen nodded, a grim understanding passing between us. "The shell companies are fully structured and legally blind, Paul. We have the capital staged and ready for deployment. We can initiate the buyout immediately. Do what I instructed. Contact the private equity firm today. Use my offshore portfolio. Buy Todd's $2 million debt in full. Purchase the paper on the underground gambling loans if you can find the brokers. I want to buy every single liability that man has attached his name to. By the time I walk into his office tomorrow morning to sign those fraudulent papers, I want to be the sole master of his financial universe." I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the war room. Todd and Rachel thought they were playing a brilliant, manipulative game against a weak and fading old man. They thought they had written the perfect script for my tragic, quiet ending, but they had absolutely no idea that I was about to buy the theater lock, all the doors, and rewrite the final act. Tomorrow morning, I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would sign their papers, I would play the fool, and I would let them celebrate their false victory. Because the higher they climbed on their mountain of lies, the more devastating it would be when I finally pulled the ground out from under them. For 40 years, I woke up before the sun even considered rising. I poured concrete in the freezing rain. I negotiated brutal zoning laws with corrupt city officials. I sacrificed my own comfort, my own hobbies, and often my own peace of mind to build a commercial real estate empire from absolutely nothing. People like Todd believe that wealth is a flashy imported car or a loud custom-tailored suit. They believe wealth is something you aggressively show off at an exclusive country club to impress weak men you secretly despise. But real wealth is entirely silent. Real wealth does not boast, and it certainly does not beg. It compounds quietly in the dark, waiting for the exact moment it is needed. After my primary company went public decades ago, I took a massive portion of my early founder equity and completely vanished it into a complex labyrinth of international blind trusts and offshore holding accounts. I did it because I wanted my wife and my daughter to have an ultimate safety net that no market crash, no frivolous lawsuit, and no economic depression could ever touch. I hid it because I knew firsthand that highly visible money attracts desperate parasites. I wanted Rachel to grow up with a solid work ethic, not a crippling sense of entitlement. I just never imagined that the deadliest parasite of all would end up marrying my only daughter, and that she would eagerly help him try to bleed me dry. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table in our secure downtown war room and watched Stephen work his legal magic. Stephen was not just a corporate lawyer. He was a ruthless legal surgeon who specialized in complete financial decapitation. We did not use my name for the transaction. We did not use the name of my primary company or any entity vaguely associated with my legacy. Stephen activated a dormant shell corporation based out of a strict overseas jurisdiction that legally forbids the public disclosure of its beneficial owners. To the outside world, the entity stepping up to purchase the debt was just a faceless, aggressive international holding company with an endless supply of liquid capital. I authorized the immediate transfer of $3 million from my oldest offshore account to fund the operation. I watched the digital confirmation flash across the large computer monitor on the wall. That money represented years of my sweat and blood, but I felt absolutely no hesitation deploying it now. It was no longer a protective safety net for my family. It was a targeted weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at the arrogant man who was trying to steal my sanity and my home. Brian took the lead on handling the delicate communication with the private equity firm that currently held the massive fraudulent loan Todd had taken out against my house. This particular firm was well known in our industry for being predatory and ruthless, but they were also notoriously greedy and always eager for a quick cash infusion. Todd was already teetering on the edge of a massive, unrecoverable default. His portfolio was heavily flagged as highly toxic debt. When Stephen reached out, representing our anonymous holding company, and offered to buy the paper on Todd completely outright, the private equity vultures did not even hesitate. They did not care about Todd or his fake luxury lifestyle. They certainly did not care about the ethics of the forged signature on the collateral documents. They only cared about clearing a high-risk, impending liability off their quarterly balance sheet before the fiscal year ended. Stephen negotiated with ice-cold precision. He offered to take the entire toxic debt portfolio off their hands immediately, including the fraudulent collateral on my personal home, provided they signed a total transfer of rights within a matter of hours. The speed of corporate greed is a truly terrifying thing to witness, but today it was working entirely in my favor. While Stephen secured the private equity debt, Brian utilized his extensive network of forensic contacts to track down the secondary shadow markets where Todd's illegal gambling debts had been sold off. Todd owed a staggering amount of money to highly dangerous underground syndicates. These syndicates often bundled their bad debts and sold them to aggressive collection agencies at a steep discount just to recoup their initial losses. Through a series of highly discreet intermediaries, Brian managed to legally purchase the rights to collect on those personal gambling debts. We bundled them directly into the offshore shell company. The sun slowly crept across the sky outside the office windows, casting long, dark shadows across the conference table. We sat in silence as the digital contracts were drafted, reviewed, and finalized by Stephen and his team of associates. The entire transaction took less than 7 hours. Todd had spent years digging a massive financial grave through his reckless gambling, his pathetic arrogance, and his disastrous offshore investments. It took me exactly 7 hours to legally purchase the deed to that grave. Stephen printed the final master transfer agreement and slid it across the heavy wooden table toward me. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen and stepped back, giving me the room. I looked down at the crisp white documents. These were not the fake conservatorship forms my treacherous daughter wanted me to clumsily sign. These were ironclad, legally binding contracts that transferred every single ounce of Todd's financial existence directly into my hands. I signed my name with a steady, perfect signature. There was no shaking. There was no hesitation. There was only the cold, absolute certainty of a man executing a flawless checkmate. The father who had happily paid for Rachel's lavish wedding was completely gone. The grandfatherly figure they thought they were easily manipulating had been entirely erased. In their place stood the man who had crushed rival developers and hostile corporate takeovers without breaking a single sweat. Brian leaned back in his chair, rubbed his tired eyes, and let out a long, heavy breath. "It is officially done, Paul," he said quietly. The private equity firm has relinquished all rights. The underground gambling brokers have been completely bought out through the secondary debt markets. The wire transfers have cleared all global channels. You are now the sole legal owner of every single liability Todd has ever created. I nodded slowly, processing the sheer magnitude of what we had just accomplished. Todd had absolutely no idea. He was probably sitting in his leased luxury office right now, adjusting his expensive designer tie and laughing with my daughter about how easily they were going to lock me in an asylum tomorrow morning. They truly thought they controlled the entire board. They thought they held my future in the palms of their greedy hands. They did not realize that I now legally owned their entire past, present, and future. I owned the massive debt on the luxury cars they drove to their country club dinners. I owned the staggering fraudulent loan they took out against my quiet suburban home. I owned the gambling debts that kept Todd awake sweating in the middle of the night. I was now their sole creditor, their ultimate judge, and their executioner. I held the power to liquidate their entire lives with a single phone call. Stephen packed the signed documents into a secure leather briefcase and locked the combination. "Tomorrow morning you go into the lion's den, Paul," he said, his voice completely serious. "They are going to push those new conservatorship papers in front of you. They are going to threaten you with an assisted living facility if you do not comply. You have to play the part perfectly. If Todd suspects even for a second that he has been financially compromised, before he signs his name to those fraudulent documents, he might panic and try to flee the country." I stood up from the conference table and buttoned my suit jacket. "He will not suspect a thing," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "He is far too arrogant to believe an old man could ever outsmart him. He believes he is the smartest person in any room he walks into. That arrogance is his greatest weakness, and tomorrow I am going to let him choke on it." I left the secure building and walked out into the busy city streets. The evening commute was in full swing, with thousands of people rushing home to their families. I was going back to an empty house knowing that the only family I had left was actively plotting my total destruction. But I did not feel sorrow and I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, unstoppable sense of purpose. All I had to do now was walk into his office tomorrow morning, play the broken old man one last time, and let him hand me the rope. I parked my reliable old sedan in the massive underground garage of the towering glass and steel building where Todd leased his executive suite. The sprawling corporate headquarters was a monument to his massive ego built entirely on the credit of my life's work. I walked slowly to the elevator, letting my shoulders stoop and practicing the vacant, frightened expression I would need to wear for the next hour. My heart beat with a steady, heavy rhythm. I was walking directly into the trap they had so carefully laid for me, but I was the one who had secretly filled the bottom of the pit with sharp spikes. When the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse floor, I was greeted by a young receptionist who looked at my modest clothing with a hint of confusion. I told her I was Paul Bennett and I was there to see Todd. She pointed me toward a set of heavy frosted glass doors at the end of a long, pristine hallway. I shuffled down the corridor, dragging my feet slightly against the expensive carpet, making sure I looked every bit the fragile old man they expected to see. I slowly pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into Todd's massive corner office. The room was aggressively modern with sharp angles, stark white furniture, and a sweeping panoramic view of the city skyline. Todd was sitting behind a massive marble desk, looking like a king presiding over his stolen kingdom. Rachel was sitting in one of the sleek leather chairs opposite his desk. The very second she saw me enter, her entire demeanor shifted. She rushed over to me and wrapped her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. She let out a soft, manufactured sob that made my stomach turn. She told me how worried she had been, how stressful yesterday was, and how she only wanted what was best for me. The scent of her incredibly expensive perfume washed over me completely, suffocating and overwhelmingly fake. I patted her back with a trembling hand, playing the part of the confused and grateful father. I told her I was just tired and that my mind had been playing tricks on me lately. She guided me to the chair next to hers, treating me as if my bones would turn to dust if I sat down too quickly. Todd leaned forward, resting his elbows on his immaculate desk, and clasped his hands together. He put on his best sympathetic face, a mask of deep concern that he probably practiced in the mirror every morning. He told me that they had been terrified when I became so disoriented at dinner the other night. He said he had consulted with some specialists and that they all agreed I needed immediate protection and 24-hour supervision. He smoothly pulled a thick stack of legal documents from a drawer and slid them precisely across to the smooth marble surface toward me. He explained in a soft, patronizing voice that these papers would simply grant him and Rachel the legal authority to handle my stressful medical decisions and my complicated finances, so I could finally just relax and rest. He promised me they had found a beautiful, peaceful facility where I would be safe and looked after by top-tier professionals. Every single word was a polished, calculated lie designed to strip away my freedom while sounding like a generous act of love. I stared down at the documents, feeling the cold reality of their betrayal staring back at me. This was the absolute point of no return. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my reading glasses, letting my hands shake violently. I fumbled with the frames before finally resting them on the bridge of my nose. I looked at the pages, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by the dense legal jargon. I told Todd that there were just too many pages, and I asked him if he was absolutely sure this was the right thing to do. Rachel leaned over and placed her hand over mine. She told me I did not need to read the difficult words, and that I just needed to trust them, because family always protects family. I looked into the eyes of my only daughter, searching for even a tiny flicker of genuine guilt or hesitation, but I found absolutely nothing. Her eyes were empty and completely focused on the prize. I picked up the heavy black pen Todd offered me. My lawyer, Stephen, had been exceptionally clear about exactly what I needed to do in this moment. A signature is a binding legal contract, but a signature made under duress or altered significantly from a legally established historical baseline can be easily contested by a skilled forensic handwriting expert. For 40 years, on every single contract, bank loan, and corporate charter I had ever signed, I always included my middle initial, and I always separated my first and last name with a distinct, sharp break. Today, I pressed the pen to the paper and let my hand tremble. I intentionally left out my middle initial. I looped the letters of my first and last name together in a sloppy, continuous scrawl that I had not used since I was a teenager. I made sure to press too hard in some places and too lightly in others, mimicking the declining motor skills of advanced dementia. I slowly signed my altered name on every single page they pushed in front of me. With every stroke of the pen, I was willingly walking into their cage, but I was also handing them the forged key that would eventually lock them inside with me. When I finally finished signing the last page, Todd snatched the documents away with a speed that completely betrayed his manufactured patience. He quickly tapped the edges of the paper against the desk to align them and slipped them safely into a thick manila envelope. The relief radiating from him was palpable. He told me I had done the right thing and that I was going to be so much happier now. Rachel kissed my cheek and told me she would come by my house tomorrow to help me pack a small bag for the transition. I nodded slowly, staring blankly at the floor. I stood up, using the armrest to support my weight, and shuffled slowly toward the heavy glass door. I told them I was very tired and just wanted to go home and sleep. I walked out into the hallway and let the heavy door click shut behind me. But I had intentionally left something behind. My heavy dark wool winter coat was still hanging perfectly undisturbed on the designer coat rack, tucked neatly in the corner of Todd's office. I did not wait for the elevator. I pushed open the heavy door to the emergency stairwell and quickly walked down the concrete steps, shedding the fragile old man persona completely. My posture straightened, and my mind raced with razor-sharp clarity. Hidden deep inside the inner breast pocket of the coat I had left behind was a high-end digital recording device that Brian had provided. It was voice-activated, heavily shielded against background noise, and currently transmitting a live encrypted audio feed directly to my smartphone. I reached the underground parking garage and got into my car, locking the doors immediately. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the secure application, and connected my wireless earpiece. I needed to know exactly what happened the very second I was no longer in the room. I sat in the dim light of the parking garage staring at the concrete wall and listened as the audio feed clicked to life in my ear. The silence in the office lasted only a few seconds before the true nature of my family was completely unleashed. First, I heard a loud, heavy sigh of profound relief from Todd, followed immediately by the sound of a popping cork and liquid pouring into glasses. He was actually opening a bottle of champagne in the middle of the morning to celebrate my demise. Then Rachel spoke, and her voice was entirely stripped of the tearful daughter act. She laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. "I cannot believe how easy that was," she said, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. "Did you see his hands shaking, Todd? He barely even looked at the pages. He just signed his life away like a helpless child." I heard Todd laugh along with her, the sound of clinking glass confirming their celebratory toast. "I told you it would work," Todd replied, his voice loud and arrogant. "The old fool is completely checked out. I am sending these documents to the private equity firm right now. By this afternoon, the house is officially collateral. The debt is handled, and we finally control the trust fund." I sat in my car listening as my daughter openly mocked the man who had given her everything. Rachel started imitating my trembling voice, repeating the confused questions I had asked about the paperwork, turning my manufactured vulnerability into a hilarious joke for her husband. She told Todd that she had already picked out an aggressive estate liquidator to clear out my house by the weekend. She complained about having to go to my house tomorrow to pack my things, saying the smell of my old furniture made her sick. She explicitly discussed the cheap, low-tier care facility they had chosen for me, laughing about how I would be locked in a tiny, sterile room, completely isolated from the outside world, while they spent my money remodeling their kitchen and taking ski trips to Aspen. They were gloating over the corpse of my independence, completely unaware that they were celebrating their own funeral. I listened until the champagne was finished, and their cruel laughter faded into discussions about their upcoming luxury purchases. Every word they spoke was captured, saved, and securely uploaded to Brian's servers. They had provided the final, undeniable proof of their malicious intent and their complete lack of basic human empathy. I took the earpiece out and placed my phone on the passenger seat. I started the engine of my reliable old sedan and pulled out of the dark underground garage into the bright morning sunlight. Todd and Rachel thought they had just conquered my empire and secured their wealthy future. They thought I was going home to wait helplessly for them to pack me away into a forgotten corner of the world. They had absolutely no idea that in just 48 hours, I was going to bring the entire sky crashing down directly onto their heads. 48 hours passed in absolute silence. I sat in the war room with Stephen and Brian, watching the digital clock on the wall tick down to the exact minute we had agreed upon. For 2 days, I had remained inside my house, ignoring the condescending text messages from Rachel about packing my bags. I simply told her I was resting and preparing for the transition. They were so blinded by their perceived victory that they did not even bother to check if the private equity firm had processed their forged collateral. They assumed the corporate wheels were turning in their favor. They had absolutely no idea that the vehicle driving those wheels was now entirely controlled by me. Stephen looked at his watch and nodded. It was exactly 10 in the morning on a Thursday. He opened his laptop and executed the digital command we had prepared. An official certified legal demand was sent directly to Todd's executive inbox and simultaneously delivered by a private courier to his physical office. The document was issued by the anonymous offshore shell company we had used to buy up all of his toxic debt. It was a formal and devastating margin call. The terms were brutally simple and legally indisputable. Todd was given exactly 7 days to produce $2 million in liquid cash. If he failed to meet the deadline, the shell company would immediately seize his luxury vehicles, his personal bank accounts, and every single remaining asset attached to his name. The trap had officially snapped shut. Brian had managed to tap into the internal security cameras of Todd's corporate suite, using the same access codes Todd had foolishly left unchanged for years. We sat in the dark room and watched the silent video feed on the large monitor. We saw the exact moment the courier handed the heavy envelope to the receptionist. We watched as she walked it back to Todd's desk. Todd was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, probably dreaming about how he was going to spend my trust fund. He casually tore open the envelope and began to read the demand letter. I watched as the color completely drained from his face. He leaned forward so fast he almost knocked over his coffee. He frantically flipped through the pages, his hands shaking violently as he read the ironclad terms of the margin call. The private equity firm had sold his debt. His secret underground gambling markers had been consolidated. A nameless, faceless international entity was now calling in all his chips all at once. He picked up his office phone and began dialing frantically. He was undoubtedly calling the private equity firm, demanding to know why they had sold his paper. But they would not tell him anything because they simply did not care. They had their money, and Todd was now someone else's problem. We watched him pace around his office like a trapped animal. He ran his hands through his hair, pulling at the roots in absolute panic. $2 million in 7 days is an impossible sum for a man who is secretly drowning in offshore losses and gambling debts. But then I saw his posture suddenly change. He stopped pacing and let out a long breath. He walked back to his desk and picked up the thick manila envelope containing the fraudulent conservatorship papers I had signed 2 days ago. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He believed he had the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. He believed he held the legal keys to my entire visible fortune. He thought he could just casually walk into my bank and liquidate my primary trust fund to save his own miserable skin. Less than an hour later, Stephen was sitting behind his massive polished desk in his own high-end law office. I was sitting in the adjacent private room listening to the audio feed through a cracked door. Todd marched into Stephen's reception area demanding an immediate audience. He did not have an appointment, but desperation makes people incredibly bold. Stephen buzzed him in, and Todd strode into the room, carrying himself with that false, unearned arrogance I despised so much. Todd slapped the thick stack of signed conservatorship papers directly onto Stephen's desk. He did not even bother with small talk. He looked down at Stephen and declared that my mental health had severely declined and that he and Rachel had been forced to take permanent legal control of my affairs. He demanded that Stephen immediately release $2 million from my primary trust fund and wire it to a specific account to cover what he called emergency transition expenses for my long-term medical care. He spoke with the complete confidence of a man who believed he had just won the lottery. I listened from the other room as Stephen slowly picked up the documents. I could hear the rustle of the paper as he pretended to read them carefully. Stephen is a master of psychological warfare. He let the silence drag on for several agonizing minutes, forcing Todd to stand there and sweat. Finally, Stephen placed the documents back on the desk and folded his hands. He spoke in a tone that was polite but absolutely freezing. He told Todd that the conservatorship papers appeared to be in order, but they were completely, utterly, and entirely useless for his current demands. I heard Todd sputter in confusion. He aggressively asked Stephen what he meant by useless, demanding to know why the transfer could not be initiated immediately. He reminded Stephen that he had legal power of attorney and full conservatorship over my estate. He raised his voice, trying to use intimidation to force the transaction. Stephen remained completely unbothered by the childish outburst. He calmly explained the intricate legal reality of my financial structure. He told Todd that my primary trust fund was not a simple savings account. It was an irrevocable generation-skipping trust protected by a pre-existing legal lock that I had established decades ago. Stephen explained that the trust contained a specific strict poison pill provision regarding mental incapacitation. If I were ever declared mentally incompetent or placed under a conservatorship, the trust fund would instantly freeze. The principal balance would be legally locked away in perpetuity and could only be used to pay directly invoiced medical providers for my basic physical care. Not a single penny could ever be liquidated, withdrawn, or transferred by a conservator for any other purpose whatsoever. The silence that followed Stephen's explanation was thick and heavy. Todd was completely paralyzed. He asked Stephen if there was any way to bypass the provision, or petition a judge to override the lock. Stephen chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. He told Todd that the trust was purposefully designed to be completely bulletproof against greedy heirs and hostile financial takeovers. He explained that breaking the trust would require years of federal litigation and millions of dollars in legal fees, with absolutely no guarantee of success. The money Todd so desperately needed was sitting right in front of him, entirely untouchable, separated by a wall of impenetrable legal armor. Todd began to panic openly. His voice cracked as he asked what he was supposed to do with the conservatorship if he could not access the cash. Stephen simply replied that Todd was now legally responsible for managing my care, coordinating my doctors, and ensuring my safety, but he would not receive a single dime of compensation or access to my capital to do so. The golden goose Todd thought he had slaughtered had turned out to be made of solid, unyielding stone. I listened as Todd stumbled backward, his breathing ragged and uneven. He realized in that exact moment that his perfect plan had completely backfired. He had spent months plotting to steal my money, orchestrating fake medical records, and paying off criminal forgers to gain control of an asset he could never actually touch. Worse, he had just trapped himself into legally managing my life, while a faceless offshore creditor was preparing to rip his own life to shreds in exactly 7 days. Todd did not say another word. I heard him turn and practically run out of Stephen's office, leaving the worthless forged documents sitting abandoned on the desk. I stepped out of the adjacent room and walked over to Stephen. We looked down at the papers and smiled. Todd was completely cornered with absolutely nowhere left to hide. He was suffocating under the crushing weight of a $2 million margin call, and his only lifeline had just turned into an anchor dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. The panic was going to consume him over the next few days. He was going to desperately scramble for a way out, a way to generate $2 million in liquid cash before the 7-day deadline expired. And I knew exactly what he was going to try to do next. He was going to look at the only remaining asset he had left to exploit. My legacy company, the company I had built from the ground up, the company he thought he legally managed. He was going to try to sell it off for parts to save himself, and when he did, I would be waiting in the shadows, ready to deliver the final lethal strike. The clock was ticking down with the brutal precision of a guillotine. Todd had exactly 6 days left to find $2 million in liquid cash. He had walked out of Stephen's office completely shattered, and I knew it was only a matter of hours before the blind panic transformed into reckless desperation. Brian kept the surveillance feeds running around the clock. We listened as Todd returned to his leased penthouse office and locked the heavy glass doors behind him. He immediately called Rachel. His voice was high-pitched and trembling as he explained the poison pill provision in my trust fund. He told her the money was permanently locked and that the conservatorship they had committed forgery to obtain was completely useless for paying off his massive debt. I listened to my daughter react. There was no concern for my well-being and no regret for their criminal actions. She simply shrieked in absolute fury. She screamed at Todd, calling him a failure, and demanding to know how they were going to save their mansion and their luxury cars from the impending asset seizure. Todd begged her to calm down, telling her he had one last card to play. He, pacing the floor of his office, told Rachel that they still had full executive control over my life work. They still had the legal authority to sign contracts on behalf of my commercial real estate development company. If they could not steal my personal trust fund, they were going to sell my entire corporate legacy to the highest bidder. The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. Todd did not want to sell the company through proper legal channels or seek the best possible valuation for the shareholders. A legitimate corporate sale takes months of careful audits and regulatory approvals. Todd did not have months. He had less than a week. He needed a buyer who was wealthy enough to swallow the company whole and ruthless enough to look past the rushed, desperate nature of the transaction. He needed a corporate shark. He picked up his phone and called the chief executive officer of Vanguard Properties. Vanguard was my oldest and most bitter industry rival. For 30 years, I had fought them tooth and nail over prime downtown zoning permits and lucrative commercial contracts. I had always beaten them because I played the long game and built properties that lasted. Todd offered my entire company to Vanguard for absolutely pennies on the dollar. It was a complete fire sale. Brian intercepted the digital term sheets as soon as they were drafted. I sat in the war room and stared at the screens as the numbers flashed before my eyes. Todd was undervaluing 40 years of my blood, sweat, and tears by nearly 70%. He was practically giving away prime commercial real estate assets just to secure one specific condition. He demanded a massive, non-refundable executive signing bonus of $2 million payable in cash the very second the merger documents were signed. He disguised the request as a golden parachute for his leadership team, but Vanguard knew exactly what it was. It was blood money. The chief executive of Vanguard was an arrogant man who had hated me for decades. The opportunity to swallow my legacy company for a fraction of its true worth, while simultaneously publicly humiliating the Bennett name, was a prize he simply could not resist. He agreed to the terms without a single hesitation. He agreed to wire the $2 million signing bonus into Todd's personal offshore account the moment the ink dried on the final contracts. It was a dirty backroom deal born of total desperation and blinding corporate greed. But Todd and Rachel had a massive psychological problem. They could not simply sign away a legendary real estate empire in a quiet, dark room. Their entire lives were built on the fragile illusion of success and prestige. If the industry found out they had secretly sold the company in a desperate fire sale, their social standing in the city would be completely ruined. They needed a cover story. They needed to spin this catastrophic failure into a narrative of visionary corporate triumph. Rachel took charge of the illusion. She has always been a master of appearances. She organized a massive, lavish corporate gala to celebrate the transaction. She booked the grand ballroom of the most expensive luxury hotel in the downtown district. She sent out embossed invitations to city council members, rival developers, and wealthy socialites. She framed the disastrous fire sale as a historic strategic merger that would redefine the city skyline. She wanted to sign the final documents publicly on a stage surrounded by flashing cameras and popping champagne corks. She wanted the entire city to watch her and Todd cement their legacy as real estate royalty. The hypocrisy was so thick it was almost suffocating. They were throwing a $500,000 party to celebrate the fact that they were secretly drowning. They were using company funds to buy expensive floral arrangements and hire classical string quartets, all to mask the terrifying reality that they were literally days away from total financial ruin and federal prison. They believed that if they smiled bright enough and wore expensive enough clothing, no one would notice the smoke pouring out of the sinking ship. I sat in the war room with Stephen and Brian watching the digital invitations go out. Stephen leaned back in his chair and adjusted his tie. He asked me if I wanted him to file the injunction and stop the gala before it even started. We had the original corporate charter. We had the absolute legal proof that Todd never possessed the majority voting shares required to authorize a corporate sale. We could shut down the entire event with a single phone call to a judge. I looked at the glowing computer monitors displaying the seating charts and catering menus for Rachel's lavish party. I shook my head slowly. I told Stephen that stopping them quietly in a courtroom was entirely insufficient. Todd and Rachel wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to stand on a stage and be treated like royalty while they sold my life work to cover their pathetic gambling debts. They wanted an audience. I decided right then and there that I was going to give them the biggest audience they had ever seen. Let them host their expensive party, I instructed Stephen. Let Vanguard executives put on their finest suits and practice their victory speeches. Let Rachel buy her designer gown, and let Todd believe he has finally outsmarted the hangman. We are not going to stop the merger today. We are going to let them walk right up to the very edge of the cliff. We are going to let them taste the victory. And then we are going to burn their entire world down in front of every single person they have ever tried to impress. Brian smiled and began typing rapidly on his keyboard, setting up the necessary financial tripwires. He contacted his counterparts at the federal investigative bureaus, anonymously feeding them the digital trails of Todd's wire fraud and forged signatures. The authorities were already quietly building a massive federal case based on the breadcrumbs Brian had been dropping all week. A high-profile public gala filled with wealthy investors and corporate executives was the absolute perfect venue for a dramatic federal takedown. I left the war room and drove to a small private tailor shop on the edge of the city. I did not need my old comfortable sweaters or the oversized trousers I used to play the fragile, declining widower. I needed armor. I ordered a custom-tailored midnight black tuxedo. I stood in front of the tall mirrors as the tailor adjusted the crisp white shirt and pinned the sharp lines of the jacket. The stooped shoulders and trembling hands of the old man they thought they knew were completely gone. The reflection staring back at me was a man forged in the fires of betrayal. For days, Todd and Rachel had been celebrating my supposed mental decline. They had mocked my trembling hands and laughed at my engineered confusion. They firmly believed I was currently sitting in my quiet suburban home waiting helplessly for a transport van to take me to a sterile, locked room. They thought the old man was finally out of the way, leaving the vault completely unguarded. The night of the gala rapidly approached. The city buzzed with rumors about the historic merger between Bennett Holdings and Vanguard Properties. The financial newspapers published glowing articles about Todd's visionary leadership, completely unaware that the visionary was actually a desperate gambling addict trying to outrun a faceless offshore creditor. Rachel flooded her social media accounts with pictures of the grand ballroom, boasting about her keen eye for event design and her exciting new chapter as a corporate titan. I sat in my quiet living room on the night of the event. The house was perfectly still. I polished my dark leather dress shoes and adjusted the silver cufflinks my late wife had given me on our 20th anniversary. I felt her presence in the quiet corners of the room, giving me the strength to do what had to be done. It is the hardest thing in the world for a father to actively destroy his own child, but Rachel had stopped being my daughter the moment she placed a price tag on my sanity and wished for my death. She had chosen her path, and now she was going to face the brutal, uncompromising destination. I put on the dark tuxedo jacket and checked my reflection one last time. I slipped my phone into my pocket containing the digital keys to my offshore empire and the audio recordings of their ultimate betrayal. I walked out the front door and locked it securely behind me. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been taken. The guests were taking their seats and the orchestra was playing. It was finally time to go to the party. The Grand Imperial Hotel stood like a glowing beacon of excess in the center of the downtown district. I handed the keys of my reliable sedan to a bewildered valet who was busy parking a line of exotic sports cars. I smoothed the lapels of my custom midnight black tuxedo and walked through the towering glass doors. The lobby was a symphony of polished marble and crystal chandeliers, but I barely noticed the opulence. My focus was entirely locked on the grand ballroom at the end of the long corridor. The muffled sound of a classical string quartet and the steady hum of hundreds of wealthy voices leaked through the heavy mahogany double doors. I pushed them open and stepped into the blinding light of my daughter's manufactured illusion. The ballroom was decorated with an obscene level of extravagance. Massive centerpieces of white orchids and imported roses sat on dozens of tables covered in crisp linen. Waiters in white coats circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. Every major player in the city commercial real estate industry was standing in that room. I saw city council members I had negotiated with decades ago. I saw rival developers I had beaten in fair bidding wars, standing on a raised platform near the front of the room holding a microphone and a glass of champagne was Todd. Rachel stood right beside him, wearing a sparkling silver designer gown that probably cost more than my first house. They were holding court, beaming with the arrogant pride of two people who believed they had successfully stolen a kingdom. Standing near the podium was the chief executive of Vanguard Properties, looking like a hungry shark waiting for his meal. He was holding a sleek leather folder containing the merger contracts. Todd raised his glass to the crowd, preparing to make his grand speech about the historic sale of Bennett Holdings. He opened his mouth to speak, but his eyes suddenly darted toward the back of the room and locked directly onto me. The transformation, was absolute and instantaneous. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from Todd's face. His skin turned the color of wet ash. He lowered his champagne flute so fast that the golden liquid sloshed over the rim and stained his expensive suit sleeve. Rachel noticed his panic and followed his gaze. When she saw me standing there, the crystal glass slipped right through her fingers and shattered against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed through the massive ballroom, causing dozens of guests to turn their heads. They expected to see a hunched, fragile old man wandering in confusion. They expected the pathetic victim they had mocked in their luxury vehicle. Instead, they saw a man standing tall and rigid, with perfectly squared shoulders and a gaze as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd naturally parted for me. Many of these people had known me for 30 years. They respected the empire I had built, and they murmured in surprise as I walked past them, recognizing the absolute authority radiating from my every step. The symphony of elite networking ground to a halt. As I walked down the center aisle, I noticed the faces of men and women I had mentored. I saw bankers who had financed my first commercial projects 30 years ago. They looked at Todd, and then they looked at me, sensing the heavy shift in the atmosphere. The scent of roasted prime rib and expensive perfume hung thick in the air, but all I could smell was the raw metallic scent of pure adrenaline. Todd completely panicked. He dropped his microphone on the podium and frantically waved his hand, signaling for the hotel security team. Two large, heavily muscled security guards in dark suits stepped into the center aisle, completely blocking my path to the stage. Todd rushed down the steps of the platform and hurried over to the guards, whispering furiously, but loud enough for the front row of guests to hear. He told the guards they had to escort me out immediately. He stammered that I was his father-in-law and that I was completely mentally unwell. He claimed I suffered from advanced dementia and had wandered away from a care facility. He begged them to just take me to a quiet room before I hurt myself or ruined the evening. The security guards looked at me with a mixture of pity and caution. One of them reached out a large hand and gently touched my shoulder, intending to guide me away. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene. I simply turned my head and looked directly into the guard's eyes, with the chilling, unyielding confidence of a man who owned the very ground they were standing on. I told him to take his hand off me, son. I kept my voice low, even, and carrying a dangerous weight. I told him I was Paul Bennett, and I built this company. I told him I built half the skyline outside those windows, and if he did not step aside right now, I would make sure he never worked in this city again. The guard instantly froze. He looked at my sharp tuxedo, my steady hands, and the absolute clarity in my eyes. He realized immediately that he was not dealing with a confused dementia patient. He was dealing with a titan of industry who had just been deeply insulted. The guard slowly lowered his hand and took a step back, pulling his partner with him. The path to the stage was completely clear. Todd stood frozen in my path, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. He hissed through gritted teeth with sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He told me I could not be here because I signed the papers and was legally incompetent. He said I was ruining everything. I did not even stop walking. I brushed right past him, hitting his shoulder with enough force to make him stumble backward. I climbed the short stairs to the raised platform. Rachel was standing near the podium, looking like a terrified ghost. The glittering silver gown she wore suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry under the harsh glare of the stage lights. She reached for my wrist, and her hands were trembling violently. She tried to step in front of me, raising her hands in a desperate, pleading gesture. She whispered with genuine fear that we could talk about this at home because we were family. She tried to convey a daughterly affection that she had abandoned months ago. But I saw right through the hollow performance. She was not afraid for my health. She was terrified that the massive pile of stolen money she was standing on was about to be pulled out from under her feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at the daughter I had loved with my entire soul. I looked at the woman who had coldly calculated the financial burden of my remaining heartbeats. I told her we stopped being family, the moment she put a price tag on my sanity. My voice was completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I stepped past her and walked directly to the podium. The chief executive of Vanguard Properties stood just a few feet away, looking confused and highly irritated by the interruption. He clutched the leather folder containing the merger contracts tightly against his chest. When I gripped the podium, I felt the polished wood beneath my fingertips. This was a stage I had stood on many times before, delivering keynote speeches and accepting industry awards. But tonight, I was not here to accept an award. I was here to deliver an execution. I placed both of my hands firmly on the edges of the wooden podium and leaned into the microphone. A sharp squeal of audio feedback pierced the air, cutting through the low murmurs of the confused crowd. The classical string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Every single conversation in the massive ballroom died instantly. Hundreds of faces stared up at me, waiting in absolute breathless silence. The heavy quiet was so profound that the room felt entirely vacuum-sealed. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Every wealthy investor, every rival developer, every city politician held their breath. They knew a storm was breaking, and they were trapped inside the room with the lightning. I let the silence hang, allowing the tension to build until it was almost unbearable. I wanted Todd to feel the agonizing weight of his impending doom. I wanted Rachel to realize that her entire social standing in the city was about to evaporate into thin air. Only then did I lean into the microphone and begin to speak. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said. My voice boomed clearly through the high-quality speakers and echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "My name is Paul Bennett, and most of you know me. Some of you have done business with me. All of you are here tonight under the false pretense of celebrating a historic corporate merger." I paused, looking directly down at Todd, who was standing paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs. I told the crowd that there would be no merger tonight. I declared that there would be no sale of Bennett Holdings. I explained that the man who invited them here, the man who had been pouring them champagne and shaking their hands, was a complete fraud. I told them I had come here tonight to show them exactly how he had been spending my money. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored tuxedo jacket and wrapped my fingers around a small plastic remote control. Brian had spent the entire afternoon discreetly infiltrating the audiovisual network of the luxury hotel. I pressed the central button. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which had proudly displayed the logo of my company, instantly flickered and went entirely dark. A split second later, they ignited with the blinding bright light of undeniable truth. The first image to project across the grand ballroom was a highly detailed financial ledger. I leaned into the microphone and guided the audience through the numbers with the calm precision of a surgeon. I told them they were looking at the internal operating reserves of Bennett Holdings. I pointed out the massive $8 million deficit. I explained exactly how the man standing paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs had secretly funneled corporate capital into a disastrous offshore resort project. I watched the faces of my senior board members sitting in the front row. Their expressions morphed from polite confusion into sheer, unadulterated horror as they realized their chief executive officer had been systematically bleeding the company dry. Todd tried to speak. He opened his mouth and raised his hands, but no words came out. He was suffocating under the weight of his own exposure. I did not give him a single second to recover. I pressed the button on the remote a second time. The screens shifted instantly. The spreadsheets were replaced by grainy, low-light surveillance photographs and a long list of intercepted wire transfers. The photographs showed Todd sitting at felt-covered tables in illegal underground casinos, surrounded by stacks of chips and very dangerous-looking men. I kept my voice perfectly level as I narrated his pathetic descent into severe gambling addiction. I told the room of wealthy investors and city politicians that the man who had invited them here to celebrate his corporate genius was actually drowning in millions of dollars of illicit debt. I explained that Todd had borrowed heavily from violent criminal syndicates to cover his catastrophic offshore failures, and he had lost every single penny at the poker tables. The silence in the room was entirely broken by a rising chorus of shocked murmurs. guests began to physically step away from Todd. The social elite of the city were treating him like a walking contagion. Rachel was standing near the edge of the stage, weeping uncontrollably. But I knew her tears were not born of guilt or remorse. She was crying because her carefully constructed high society illusion was being brutally publicly executed. I pressed the remote control for the third time. This was the final financial nail in his coffin. The screens illuminated with a stark black and white legal document. It was the $2 million loan agreement from the predatory private equity firm. I directed the attention of the entire ballroom to the bottom of the final page. I zoomed in on the signature line, magnifying the forged scrawl of my own name. I told the crowd the absolute worst truth of all. I explained that Todd was so terrified of the illegal bookies he owed that he went to a ruthless private equity firm for a bailout. I told them that because Todd had absolutely no assets of his own, he had committed felony forgery. He had fraudulently used my personal modest suburban home as collateral for his massive secret loan. A loud collective gasp echoed through the grand ballroom. The sheer depravity of stealing an elderly father's home to pay off illegal gambling debts was a line that even the most cutthroat corporate sharks in the room found completely repulsive. I looked directly down at Rachel. Her expensive silver gown shimmered under the stage lights, but she looked entirely broken. I told the audience that my own daughter was fully aware of the entire scheme. I told them she had actively conspired to falsify medical records to have me locked away in a psychiatric facility just so they could liquidate my trust fund and cover up their massive financial crimes. I did not play the audio recording of her wishing for my death. That specific cruelty was reserved for a more private reckoning. But the public exposure of her complicity was more than enough. The whispers in the room turned into open vocal disgust. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive voice shattered the low hum of the crowd. The chief executive of Vanguard Properties pushed his way through the front row of guests. His face was bright red with absolute fury. He was a proud, arrogant man who had spent his entire career trying to defeat me, and he had just realized he was the victim of a massive public humiliation. He marched right up to the edge of the stage, clutching the sleek leather folder containing the merger contracts. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Todd, and then turned his wrath toward me. He shouted that he did not care about family drama or gambling debts. He aggressively slapped the leather folder against the edge of the stage. He announced to the entire room that he held legally binding contracts signed by the executive leadership of Bennett Holdings. He demanded an immediate explanation. He threatened to unleash an army of corporate litigators to sue Todd, Rachel, and my entire company into complete oblivion for fraud and breach of contract. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his anger. I simply turned away from my ruined family and faced my oldest industry rival. I looked down at him with the supreme calm of a man who had won the war before the battlefield was even drawn. I spoke directly into the microphone, ensuring every single person in the room heard my response. I told the Vanguard executive that he would not be suing my company because my company had absolutely nothing to do with those fraudulent contracts. I told him he had been negotiating with a desperate ghost. The Vanguard executive scowled and demanded to know what I was talking about. He insisted that Todd was the chief executive officer and held the legal authority to authorize the corporate sale. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored tuxedo jacket. I pulled out a thick, heavily folded document printed on thick archival paper. It was not a digital copy or a forged replica. It was the original notarized corporate charter of Bennett Holdings. I slowly unfolded the heavy paper and held it up under the bright stage lights for him and the entire ballroom to see. I explained the true structure of my business. I told the crowd that 5 years ago, when my beloved wife passed away, I decided to step back from the daily operations of the company. I handed Todd and Rachel the corner offices, the fancy executive titles, and the generous salaries because I wanted to see if they could successfully steer the ship. But I never gave them the keys to the ocean. I explained that I never once relinquished the majority voting shares of the corporation. I detailed how I had placed my controlling stake into an ironclad blind trust, managed entirely by my personal attorney. I told the Vanguard executive that Todd was nothing more than a glorified middle manager playing dress-up in my company. Todd never possessed the legal authority, the board approval, or the shareholder majority required to authorize a corporate merger or a fire sale of my assets. I looked the Vanguard executive dead in the eyes and delivered the final absolute checkmate. I told him that the expensive contracts he was holding in his hands were completely legally void. I told him they were nothing more than worthless pieces of scrap paper signed by a desperate fraud who was currently suffocating under a mountain of debt. I suggested he take his worthless contracts and throw them in the nearest trash can on his way out of my building. The Vanguard executive stood completely frozen. He looked down at the leather folder in his hands and then looked back up at me. He was a ruthless corporate shark, but he was smart enough to know when he had been thoroughly and completely beaten. He realized he had almost handed $2 million in cash to a desperate criminal. Without saying another word, he turned around, aggressively shoved his way through the silent crowd of guests, and marched straight out the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. The sound of those doors slamming shut echoed like a gunshot through the room. The illusion was completely shattered. The grand corporate merger was officially dead. Todd's escape route was entirely destroyed. He had no buyer. He had no cash bonus. He had absolutely no way to pay the $2 million margin call that was going to destroy his life in exactly 48 hours. Todd collapsed onto his knees at the bottom of the stairs. He buried his face in his trembling hands and let out a pathetic, broken sob. Rachel was leaning against a table, staring blankly at the floor, as the wealthy socialites she had spent years trying to impress stared back at her with undisguised contempt. They had tried to lock me in the dark and steal my legacy. Instead, I had dragged their deepest, darkest secrets into the blinding light of a grand ballroom and burned their entire kingdom to ash. The shock in the room was a heavy physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Rachel suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged forward toward the edge of the stage, her face twisted in a mask of pure desperation and blind rage. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed to the crowd that I was a sick old man who did not know what he was talking about. She yelled to the wealthy investors that she and Todd had full legal power of attorney over my life. She shouted that they had the conservatorship documents signed just yesterday and that they were fully legally in charge of the company and my assets. She was clinging to the fake legal papers like a drowning woman holding onto a block of solid lead. I looked at her with nothing but cold pity. She still thought the forged papers could save her fragile social standing. She did not realize those exact papers were the very mechanism that had permanently sealed her doom. From the dark shadows near the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room, a tall figure emerged and walked purposefully down the center aisle. It was my attorney, Stephen Carmichael. He looked like an executioner dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. The wealthy crowd parted for him in absolute unbroken silence. He carried a heavy dark leather briefcase in his right hand. He walked up the short carpeted stairs to the stage and stood right beside me. He did not even look at Rachel. He walked straight over to Todd, who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor in a state of absolute shock. Stephen placed the heavy briefcase on the polished floor right in front of Todd and popped the brass latches. The sharp metallic sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. Stephen told Todd to look inside the case. Todd slowly reached out with trembling, sweating hands and pushed open the lid of the briefcase. Inside were thick stacks of legal contracts tightly bound in heavy red folders. Todd looked up at Stephen with eyes wide with raw terror and profound confusion. Stephen kept his voice calm and perfectly level so that the entire room could hear every single word. He told Todd that those were the official transfer documents for the $2 million margin call he had received yesterday morning. He told him that those folders contained the full legal portfolio of his toxic private equity loan and the consolidated notes from his illegal underground gambling syndicates. Todd began to shake uncontrollably. He stammered weakly, asking how Stephen had obtained those highly confidential documents from the anonymous offshore holding company. I stepped away from the wooden podium and walked slowly toward the arrogant man who had tried to steal my life. I looked down at him and delivered the final crushing blow. I told Todd that there was no anonymous offshore company. I told him that I was the shell company. A collective heavy gasp rolled through the grand ballroom. I kept my voice incredibly low, but filled with undeniable heavy authority. I explained that I had used the hidden offshore wealth I built over 40 years to legally purchase every single liability attached to his name. I told him I bought the fraudulent debt he took out against my home. I bought the markers from the dangerous, violent men he owed money to. I told him that I was now his sole unforgiving creditor. Todd looked up at me with hot tears streaming down his face, begging me to listen to him and give him another chance. I did not give him a single inch of mercy. I told him I owned the luxury imported sports car he drove to my house for dinner. I told him I owned the massive suburban estate where he and Rachel lived. I told him I owned his bank accounts, his investment portfolios, and every single dollar he thought he was going to earn in the future. I told him that because he had tried to forge my signature and lock me in a sterile asylum, I was going to call in the massive debt and liquidate his entire miserable existence. I told him he would leave this grand ballroom with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the mountain of public shame he had built for himself. Rachel fell to her knees beside him, weeping loudly and begging me to stop destroying their lives. I told her that she chose to treat her father like a disposable paycheck, and now her paycheck was permanently canceled forever. The grand ballroom was perfectly silent, save for the pathetic sobbing of the two people who had plotted to destroy me. But the grand reckoning was not completely finished. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room swung open with tremendous force. Everyone in the crowd turned their heads to look at the entrance. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the letters indicating they were federal agents printed in bold yellow across the back marched into the room. They moved with absolute tactical precision and unquestionable authority. Behind them walked Brian, my forensic accountant, carrying a thick digital tablet. Brian had spent the entire week securely transmitting every single piece of financial evidence to his federal contacts. The wire fraud, the forged signatures on the private equity loan, the stolen corporate funds, the illegal gambling transfers, and the vile conspiracy to forge medical records were all thoroughly documented and handed directly to the federal authorities. The lead federal agent walked straight down the center aisle and climbed the stairs to the stage. His heavy boots thudded loudly against the wood. He did not care about the wealthy socialites or the expensive floral arrangements scattered across the tables. He looked down at Todd, who was still kneeling next to the open briefcase of crushing debt. The agent ordered Todd to stand up immediately and put his hands behind his back. He announced in a booming voice that Todd was being placed under federal arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. Two agents grabbed Todd by his arms and roughly pulled him to his feet. They pulled his arms behind his back, and the sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Todd wept openly and pathetically as the federal agents turned him around to face the massive crowd. The city elite, the local politicians, the rival developers, and the wealthy investors all stared at him with complete and utter disgust. He had invited them all here tonight to watch him become a legendary corporate king, but instead he had provided them with front-row seats to his spectacular criminal downfall. The agents marched him down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. He hung his head in absolute shame as the distinguished guests whispered and pointed their fingers. Rachel tried to run after him, crying out his name, but a female agent held her back firmly. The agent informed Rachel that she was currently listed as an active co-conspirator and would be thoroughly interrogated tomorrow morning regarding her direct involvement in the forged medical records and the fraudulent conservatorship. Rachel collapsed against a linen-covered table, ruining a massive white floral centerpiece as she wailed in pure, unadulterated despair. I stood alone on the brightly lit stage and watched the greedy, arrogant man who had tried to bury me get marched out into the cold night to face decades in a federal prison cell. I looked out at the vast sea of shocked faces in the grand ballroom. I walked slowly back to the wooden podium and smoothly adjusted my dark silk tie. I looked at the crowd of powerful people who now knew exactly what happens when someone tries to steal from Paul Bennett. I thanked them all politely for attending the evening event, and I calmly asked them to enjoy the remaining expensive champagne because the party was officially and permanently over. I turned my back on the empty podium, walked down the short stairs, and exited through a quiet side door, leaving the shattered remains of my greedy, ungrateful family to face the absolute destruction they had brought entirely upon themselves. The grand ballroom emptied with the speed of water draining from a cracked basin. The city elite, who had eagerly arrived to drink expensive champagne and celebrate a historic corporate merger, could not flee fast enough from the stench of federal indictments and public ruin. Waiters in crisp white coats silently cleared away the shattered crystal and abandoned plates, knowing the extravagant party was over. The string quartet had packed their instruments and vanished long before the federal agents escorted Todd through the main doors. I remained standing near the edge of the elevated stage, watching the vast room transform from a lively celebration of greed into a completely hollow tomb. The silence that settled over the massive space was heavy and suffocating. I heard the slow, dragging sound of footsteps approaching from the shadows near the grand entrance. I turned and saw Rachel walking toward me. The shimmering silver designer gown she wore now looked absurdly out of place, hanging off her frame like cheap, discarded fabric. Her immaculate hair was completely disheveled, and dark mascara stained her cheeks in thick, ugly streaks. She looked like a terrified lost child, but I knew better than to trust the illusion. She stopped a few feet away from me, trembling uncontrollably as she looked up into my eyes. She did not apologize right away. Instead, she immediately began to rewrite history, playing the role of the innocent, manipulated victim. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her chest and sobbed loudly, telling me that Todd was a monster who had controlled her every move. She claimed she had absolutely no idea about the depth of his gambling debts or the horrific offshore failures. She swore on her life that Todd had forced her to go along with the conservatorship plan, and that she had only agreed because she was terrified of his violent temper. She took a hesitant step closer, reaching out to touch my sleeve, and begged me to protect her. She pleaded with me to use my wealth to pay off the private equity firm so she would not lose her beautiful house and her social standing. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and reminded me that she was my only daughter, my little girl, and that a father is supposed to save his child from the darkness. I stood perfectly still and let her desperate, empty words wash over me. For 40 years, my default instinct had been to shield her from every single consequence of her own actions. Whenever she failed, a class broke a rule or ruined a relationship, I had been there with my checkbook and my influence to smooth the path ahead of her. I realized in that quiet ballroom that my endless, unyielding protection was the exact poison that had rotted her character. I looked down at her crying face and felt a profound, overwhelming sorrow, but I did not feel an ounce of the familiar urge to rescue her. I slowly reached into the pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not raise my voice or show any anger. I simply tapped the screen and opened the secure audio file Brian had extracted from the voice command system of her luxury vehicle just days ago. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The crystal-clear audio filled the silent ballroom, bouncing off the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. First came the sound of Todd's frantic voice complaining about the private equity deadline. Then came the unmistakable, cruel voice of my own daughter. The recording played her exact words in high definition. I watched her face freeze as her own voice echoed through the empty space, complaining bitterly about how I should have expired by now. Her recorded voice whined about how much of her inheritance was being tied up in my imaginary medical expenses, and how she was completely done playing the devoted daughter. The audio captured her cold, calculated instruction to make sure the locked medical facility they chose for me was cheap, because she did not want to waste her trust fund on a man who barely knew what day it was. I stopped the recording and let the brutal silence return to the room. Rachel stood entirely paralyzed. Her mouth hung open, but she could not form a single word. The mascara tears stopped falling. She realized in that devastating moment that her carefully constructed victim narrative had just been completely incinerated by her own vicious arrogance. She could not blame Todd for the words that came directly out of her own mouth. She could not claim she was a frightened, manipulated wife when the recording proved she was the eager, enthusiastic architect of my planned destruction. I looked at her with a calmness that I knew terrified her more than any screaming rage ever could. I told her that she had spent her entire adult life calculating my net worth while completely ignoring my humanity. I explained that I had heard every single word she said in that car, and that those words had finally broken the spell she held over me. I told her that she was not a victim of a bad marriage or a sudden financial crisis, but a victim of her own bottomless entitlement. She fell to her knees on the polished hardwood floor, grabbing the hem of my trousers and weeping with genuine, unadulterated panic. She begged me to forgive her, swearing that she did not mean those words and that she was just stressed and overwhelmed by Todd's debts. She pleaded for a second chance, promising to be the daughter I always wanted if I would just unlock her trust fund and save her from the federal investigators who were going to tear her life apart tomorrow morning. I looked down at the woman who shared my blood and felt the final paternal tie snap completely. I told her that as her father, I forgave her. I explained that I was not going to carry the heavy toxic weight of hatred in my heart for the rest of my life, because hatred only poisons the person who holds it. I told her I forgave her for the forged documents, for the lies, and for wishing I was dead. But I also told her that forgiveness does not erase consequences. I stepped back, pulling the fabric of my trousers out of her desperate grip. I told her in a voice as cold and hard as solid marble that I would not spend another single dime to save her from the fire she helped ignite. I informed her that the offshore shell company still owned the massive debt attached to her home and her luxury vehicles, and I was going to liquidate every single asset immediately. I told her that when the federal agents questioned her tomorrow about her role in the medical forgery, she would have to face them completely alone without my money or my high-priced lawyers to shield her. Rachel stared up at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her safety net was permanently gone. She whispered my name one last time, a pathetic, broken plea echoing in the massive room. I did not answer her. I turned my back on the daughter who had tried to bury me alive and walked slowly toward the exit. The sound of my leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor was the only sound accompanying my departure. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and walked out into the cool, quiet night, leaving her sobbing alone in the ruins of her own catastrophic greed. The Monday morning following the absolute destruction of the fake corporate merger felt entirely different from any other morning of my life. The air in the city was crisp and clear. For 5 years, I had purposely avoided the towering glass and steel headquarters of Bennett Holdings, allowing the man who married my daughter to play his reckless games. I had visited only once recently, playing the part of a fragile and confused old man, shuffling my feet and letting my hands tremble to sign those fraudulent papers. Today, there was no shuffling. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a solid burgundy tie. My posture was perfectly straight, and my steps were heavy and deliberate. I walked through the massive revolving glass doors of the main lobby, and the entire atmosphere of the building immediately shifted. The security guards who had watched me stumble into the elevator just a few days prior now stood perfectly upright and nodded with profound respect as I walked past their desk. The whisper network of the corporate world is incredibly fast, and every single employee in the building already knew exactly what had happened at the grand ballroom over the weekend. I took the private executive elevator directly to the penthouse floor. When the polished metal doors slid open, I stepped into a reception area that was buzzing with a frantic, chaotic energy. Todd's personal assistants and the slick junior executives he had hired to build his illusion were packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, knowing that the true master of the house had returned to clean up the absolute disaster they had helped create. I did not stop to speak to any of them. I walked directly past the sleek modern artwork I despised and pushed open the heavy double doors of the main executive boardroom. Sitting around the massive conference table were the 4 senior vice presidents Todd had personally appointed. These were the men who had looked the other way while Todd funneled millions of dollars into disastrous offshore investments. These were the accountants who had actively cooked the company ledgers to hide his massive gambling debts and cover up the financial bleeding. They were sitting in absolute silence, sweating through their expensive designer suits, waiting for their inevitable execution. When I walked to the head of the table, they all abruptly stood up, trying to offer me their hands and their pathetic, manufactured apologies. I did not offer them my hand. I told them to sit down and keep their mouths completely shut. I looked at each of them, feeling a deep professional disgust. I told them that a company is only as strong as the moral compass of the people running it, and their compasses were completely broken. The vice president of finance, a sweaty, nervous man, tried to stammer out an excuse. He claimed that Todd had threatened to terminate his pension if he did not authorize the blind offshore transfers. I cut him off immediately. I told him that courage is a choice, and he had chosen to be a coward. I slid 4 thick white envelopes across the polished table. Stephen, my attorney, had spent Sunday afternoon drafting their immediate terminations with absolute legal prejudice. I informed them that they were stripped of all executive privileges, effectively immediately, and that their corporate access badges had already been deactivated. I also made it perfectly clear that Brian, my forensic accountant, had handed their manipulated financial ledgers directly to the federal investigators. I told them I would not shed a single tear when the authorities knocked on their doors to ask about their complicity in Todd's federal wire fraud. I ordered them to leave my building and never return. They grabbed their envelopes and hurried out of the room like frightened mice fleeing a burning ship. With the corporate rot successfully surgically removed, I immediately began the process of true restoration. For 5 years, Todd had systematically sidelined, demoted, or marginalized the seasoned professionals who had actually helped me build this empire from the ground up. He wanted a company filled with sycophants who would never question his reckless authority. I spent the entire afternoon calling the old guard back into the executive suite. I called in Michael, a brilliant structural engineer Todd had banished to a tiny basement office because Michael had dared to question the safety protocols on a cheap luxury development. I called in Sarah, a senior project manager who had essentially run the commercial leasing division for 20 years before Rachel decided she did not like her attitude. I sat across from them and looked into the eyes of the people who had poured their own sweat into my foundation. I apologized to them. I told them I had made a terrible mistake by walking away and leaving the keys to the kingdom in the hands of arrogant, entitled children. I immediately restored Michael to the position of chief engineer with full oversight over every ongoing construction site. I promoted Sarah to executive vice president of operations and doubled her salary on the spot. I spent the rest of the week walking the floors, visiting the accounting departments, the drafting rooms, and the legal pools. I looked my people in the eyes and promised them that the era of flashy corporate parties and reckless offshore gambling was permanently over. The atmosphere of the entire building transformed from suffocating fear to a profound, revitalized loyalty. The true heartbeat of Bennett Holdings had been completely restored, but as the weeks turned into months, I found myself sitting alone in the corner penthouse office late at night, staring out at the glowing city skyline. I was 70 years old. My health was strong, and my mind was sharper than it had been in decades, but I knew the undeniable truth of time. I had fought a brutal, exhausting war to save my legacy from the greed of my own daughter and her fraudulent husband. I had won the battle, but I realized I did not want to spend the remaining years of my life chained to a mahogany desk, reviewing quarterly profit margins and fighting local zoning boards. I had saved my empire, but I needed an exit strategy that would absolutely ensure it never fell into the hands of another corporate vulture. I called Stephen into the office for a private meeting. I poured us both a glass of water, and looked out at the city lights. I told him I did not want to sell the company to Vanguard Properties or any other faceless private equity firm that would simply gut the assets, fire the loyal workers, and sell the buildings to the highest bidder. I told him that this company was built by the bricklayers, the architects, the middle managers, and the administrative assistants who showed up every single day and did the hard, honest work. They were the ones who generated the wealth that Rachel had so eagerly tried to steal. I told Stephen I wanted to give the kingdom directly to the people who built the walls. Stephen leaned back in his chair and smiled a genuine warm smile. He suggested we restructure Bennett Holdings into an employee-owned cooperative. We would establish a massive employee stock ownership plan. I would legally transfer my controlling founder equity and the vast majority of the corporate shares directly into a trust managed entirely for the benefit of the workers. Every single employee from the janitorial staff up to the executive vice presidents would receive a proportional ownership stake in the company they dedicated their lives to. When the company profited, the workers would profit. When the company grew, the workers' wealth would grow. It was the ultimate impenetrable defense against corporate greed. The legal transition took several meticulous months to execute perfectly. Stephen and his army of associates drafted the new corporate charter, ensuring the employee trust was locked and protected by the exact same legal armor I had used to shield my own personal wealth. We established a democratic voting board composed of elected workers to oversee the executive management. I transferred billions of dollars in commercial real estate assets directly into the hands of the working-class people who had spent decades making me a very wealthy man. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I called for a company-wide town hall. There were no embossed invitations, no expensive floral arrangements, and no champagne flutes. I stood on a small wooden platform on the main operational floor, surrounded by hundreds of my employees. The men and women who drafted the blueprints, managed the properties, and kept the lights on stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear what their old boss had to say. I looked out at the sea of diverse, hard-working faces and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I spoke into a simple microphone and told them the absolute truth. I told them I was stepping down as the chief executive officer. A brief murmur of concern rippled through the crowd, but I quickly raised my hand to silence it. I told them I was not selling the company to a rival developer, and I was certainly not handing it over to another arrogant heir. I told them that starting today, they were no longer simply employees of Bennett Holdings. I announced that the legal paperwork had been officially finalized that morning, and that they were now the sole equal owners of the entire commercial real estate empire. The silence that followed was heavy and stunned, as the magnitude of the wealth transfer slowly dawned on them. Then Sarah, the project manager I had promoted, began to clap. Michael, the structural engineer, joined her. Within seconds, the entire operational floor erupted into deafening applause and joyful tears. People hugged each other, weeping, as they realized their futures, their retirements, and their families were permanently financially secure. I stood on the small platform and watched the beautiful, honest celebration of hardworking people receiving exactly what they deserved. I had spent 40 years building a legacy of concrete and steel. But in that beautiful, loud room, I realized my true legacy was the freedom and dignity I was leaving behind. I sat in the old wooden rocking chair on the front porch of my modest suburban home. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the neighbor round the corner. For a long time, I just listened to the rhythmic creak of the wood against the floorboards. This house was my sanctuary. It was the exact place where my late wife had planted the rose bushes that were currently blooming near the steps. It was the place where I had planned to spend my final years in quiet reflection. Todd and Rachel had tried to turn this beautiful home into a cheap bargaining chip to cover their pathetic gambling debts. They had forged my name and tried to hand my memories over to ruthless corporate vultures. But tonight, the deed to this property was locked safely away in my personal safe. The mortgage was completely clear, and the house was undeniably mine. I looked up at the sturdy roof and the clean brick walls, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of security. The fortress was safe, and the invaders had been permanently exiled. The silence that surrounded me now was not the lonely, heavy silence of a forgotten old man. It was the light, breathable silence of total liberation. The federal trials had concluded several months ago. The wheels of justice turned with a slow, grinding, absolute certainty. Todd was currently serving a long sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and conspiracy. His luxury cars, his country club memberships, and his underground poker games were all completely gone. Rachel had desperately tried to secure a plea deal by turning against him, but the audio recordings of her own cruel voice had sealed her fate. She was serving 5 years in a minimum security facility. She had lost her massive suburban estate and every single wealthy friend she had spent her life trying to impress. Society had completely shunned them, and I had completely cut them out of my heart. I did not visit them. I did not accept their tearful phone calls. I simply let the silence reign. With the legacy of my commercial real estate company safely transferred into the hands of the hardworking employees, I was left with the massive offshore portfolio I had built over 40 years. I did not need millions of dollars to sit on my porch and drink black coffee. I did not need luxury yachts or private islands. I needed a purpose that honored the brutal lessons I had just learned. I contacted Stephen and Brian, and together we established a massive, heavily funded charitable foundation. We dedicated the entire offshore portfolio to protecting elderly individuals who were actively being targeted by financial abuse. We hired the most aggressive legal minds and the sharpest forensic accountants in the country. We offered their services completely free of charge to any senior citizen whose family members were trying to steal their homes, drain their pensions, or force them into unwanted conservatorships. I spent my mornings reviewing the case files that our foundation handled. I saw the same terrifying patterns repeated over and over again. Greedy nephews draining savings accounts from confused aunts. Entitled children forging legal documents to sell their parents' homes. It is a quiet, invisible epidemic of cruelty. But our foundation fought back with overwhelming financial and legal force. Just last week, we saved an 80-year-old widow from being evicted by her own grandson. We froze his bank accounts, recovered her stolen retirement funds, and ensured she could stay in her home for the rest of her life. When she called me to say thank you, she cried tears of pure relief. Hearing her voice gave me a completely different kind of wealth. It was a spiritual currency that no private equity firm could ever buy, and no arrogant son-in-law could ever steal. I had turned the darkest betrayal of my life into a blazing shield for the most vulnerable people in our society. People often say that family is the most important thing in the world. They tell you that blood is thicker than water, and that you must always forgive the people who share your last name. But I have learned the incredibly painful truth about toxic family members. Sometimes the blood is completely poisoned. When a limb becomes infected with a deadly rot, you do not negotiate with the infection. You do not pretend it will heal itself if you just show it a little more love. You take a sharp knife and you amputate the limb to save the rest of the body. Cutting Rachel out of my life was a brutal, agonizing surgery. I had to mourn the total loss of the daughter I had raised, while simultaneously protecting myself from the ruthless predator she had become. The recovery was incredibly painful, but it was absolutely necessary. If I had not picked up the knife, I would have died locked in a sterile room while she danced on my grave. The incredible stress of living under their manipulation had been aging me far faster than time itself. I had spent months hunching my shoulders, pretending my hands were trembling and mimicking a fragile state of decline. Now I stand perfectly straight. My heart beats with a strong, steady rhythm. My doctor tells me my blood pressure is perfect and that I have the vitality of a man 10 years younger. The crushing burden of trying to constantly protect my ungrateful daughter from the consequences of her own actions has been completely lifted from my shoulders. I no longer have to worry about her massive debts or her desperate need for social validation. I am no longer responsible for funding her illusions. I am entirely healthy because I am entirely unburdened. The physical and emotional weight that had been pressing down on my chest for years simply vanished, the moment I walked out of that grand ballroom. I leaned back in the rocking chair and watched the sky begin to change color. The sun was slowly sinking below the tree line, painting the clouds in brilliant shades of deep orange and soft violet. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet neighborhood. A gentle evening breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean air. I did not have to pretend to be anything other than exactly what I was. I was a man who had survived a massive storm and rebuilt his own shelter. The greedy people who tried to bury me were the ones currently locked in a cage while I was sitting here watching the beautiful, vast sky. I took a sip of my coffee and let the profound peace wash over me completely. I had fought the hardest battle of my life against the people I loved the most, and I had won my absolute freedom. The night was finally here, and it was completely, entirely, and beautifully mine. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that true family is not defined by shared blood, but by genuine respect and unconditional loyalty. We are often taught that we must endlessly sacrifice our own peace and security for our children, regardless of their actions. But allowing greed and manipulation to go unchecked is not an act of love. It is a slow form of self-destruction. Setting firm boundaries and walking away from toxic people, even if they are your own flesh and blood, is not a betrayal. It is a necessary act of survival and self-respect. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that standing up for your own dignity is always the right decision.